This week on Inside Scoop, progressive wolves in centrist sheep clothing.
As soon as she was sworn into office, she became much more left-wing. And of course, the results of that have been disastrous.
Virginia is for gun grabbers, and life at war in Israel. Welcome to Inside Scoop, where we talk about all the news that's fit to print in the Washington Examiner magazine. I'm Jim Antle, your host. And this week we ask, is Virginia a lost cause? Hugo Gurdon on the cover discusses Abigail Spanberger, the new governor, and the fact that she ran a centrist campaign in an election year, but now governs as anything but. And our Jay Caruso has also written about the new push for restrictive gun laws in the state of Virginia, which had previously been a DMV holdout on the Second Amendment. But now we're even seeing Democrats threatening to wipe out all but one of the Republican-held congressional seats in the state.
These are not ordinary times, and Virginia will not sit on the sidelines while it happens. We made a promise to level the playing field, and today we're keeping our promise. Our maps are ready. Virginia is ready. We said 10-1, and we meant it.
The Democrats are ramming through a redistricting referendum, redrawing the congressional maps that shift a fair 6-5 representation to 10-1 in their favor.
So this is a state that had all Republican statewide elected officials as recently as January, including Governor Glenn Youngkin. This is a state that was viewed as something of a battleground in the presidential election, even if it hasn't actually voted for a Republican presidential candidate since 2004. Virginia has always been considered the conservative holdout of the DMV, that is the Washington, D.C. area, and large portions of the state south of the D.C. suburbs actually remain heavily Republican and quite conservative. Donald Trump won nearly 47% of the vote in Virginia, and now they may pass a redistricting map that means they only get one member of Congress in the entire state. In the past, Virginia Democrats had to at least pretend they were sort of conservative or at least different from the national Democratic brand. That was certainly the case for Mark Warner, Tim Kaine, especially Jim Webb, and even as recently as former Governor Ralph Northam. Terry McAuliffe, who'd been chairman of the Democratic Party nationally, was an exception to the rule. But now it seems that all Democrats running can be full-on progressives, not really local Virginia Southern-style Democrats, but left-wingers. And they can even muse about shooting their Republican opponents and still win a statewide election. Virginia has traditionally been the most conservative state in the sort of basic DC swamp area. But as the Democrats are consolidating power, it may look very different. Is Virginia gone? Is it going to be blue forever? Or can Republicans regain their foothold in the state, or at least get a fair congressional map? What do you think? Comment down below. The Democrats bait and switch? Continuing our coverage of Virginia politics, I'm joined this week by Washington Examiner editorial director Hugo Gurdon. And Hugo, you did the cover story of the magazine this week, and it specifically takes a look at Governor Abigail Spanberger of Virginia, but it's really a broader national phenomenon among Democrats, sort of running as centrists to get elected, right, and then pivoting back to the left once safely in office.
Yeah, there are Democrats who will say very frankly what they're going to do, like the new mayor of New York, Zoran Mandami, who says he's a socialist and he's going to govern a socialist, and he talks about the warmth of collectivism. Right. But there are far more Democrats who, in order to get themselves elected, and Abigail Spanberger is absolutely one of them, who pretend that they are in the middle, that they are centrists. During her campaign for election, Spanberger ran on talking about affordability which has played well with voters. Their concerns are about prices and prices of electricity, prices of housing, and she very much emphasized that. But as soon as she was elected, as soon as she was sworn into office, she became much more left-wing. She signed 16 supposed affordability bills into law, but they actually will make things more expensive. There were electricity mandates and the use of mandates for power companies to use battery power and spend a certain amount of their monies on that. There was restrictions on the eviction of delinquent tenants. There's just a whole raft of things that she was doing which will push the prices up. So none of those things were at all about affordability or centrism. And on top of that, there were all sorts of left-wing policies, like absolutely refusing to let Virginia officials and agencies cooperate with the federal immigration authorities. And of course, the results of that have been disastrous. They're the violent criminals who would otherwise have been handed over because they're illegal immigrants being let out and committing crimes again.
So what do you think this means for the Democrats' strategy in the midterm elections? Because as you say, there are some people like Zohran Mamdani who are very open about what they want to do, but a lot of other Democrats are going to deploy this stealth strategy, and obviously not everywhere in the country is New York City.
Yeah, I think that what we have seen over the course of the last several years, more than a decade, is the Democrats' base has become extraordinarily radical and left-wing. It's actually kind of difficult for Democrats running at state level and, eventually national level to appeal widely and at the same time have their base enthusiastic. Now, of course, President Trump helps stoke the left-wing base. People will vote in protest. But I suspect that what you will see, one of the two things, the Mamdani model or the Spanberger model. There will be politicians who, like Spanberger, calculate that their best hope with the constituency that they are seeking is to run towards the middle. And that has generally been, over the course of generations, what politicians of both sides do. They would move towards the extremes in the primary and then back to the middle in the general elections, because they appeal to their own party's base to get their nomination, and then they move back to the center. I think that will continue to be the principal model, but there are, as they look at the demographics and as they look at more and more voters under the age of 30 moving more sharply left, and within the Democratic Party, definitely a much greater sympathy for socialism and a much reduced appeal of what some people call capitalism, and I would call simple market economics. Young people moving away from that. So they'll be judging very finely what their constituency is and choosing one or the other.
And so Democrats have gotten more radical in economics, certainly, and you see all of these overt socialists now winning particularly local offices, but also some other offices. But it's really culturally where Democrats are sort of unanimously more radical than they were even, say, 10 years ago.
Yes, and on cultural matters, it also things like in foreign policy as well, they're very strongly turning against Israel, which we've seen this over the course of a considerable period of time, but now it's essentially an anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian, and by association pro-terrorist party. It's sort of axiomatic that there are no pro-life Democrats anymore.
Right.
Essentially, it used to be, people like Joe Biden was once a kind of pro-life Democrat, and he's another one, of course, who ran towards the center and then just allowed himself to be manipulated and pushed around by radical left-wingers once he was in the White House. Yes. But yes, on social policy, there are almost no conservatives left in the Democratic Party. Now that process of moving left in social policy seems to be also being replicated on the economic side as well.
Thank you, Hugo.
Thank you.
If you're watching us on YouTube, you can read Hugo's full story by clicking here on our digital magazine. Have the culture wars come to Taiwan? This week I'm joined by Washington Examiner foreign affairs reporter Timothy Nerozzi. And Tim, you took a trip to Taiwan and you noticed something somewhat interesting, where perhaps some Western progressive notions have sort of seeped in to some Taiwanese institutions in a way that might not be super conducive to their sort of national sense of self. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so this trip that I outline in my piece for the magazine sort of explores this very strange disconnect that I was observing in Taiwan, where on the one hand, Chiang Kai-shek, the founder of the modern Taiwan, a major figure in the Republic of China, which existed and fought against the People's Republic of China, it's a very strange situation where he's, on the one hand, still commemorated with statues all over the place. There are constant references to him in various political media, but he's treated as somewhat undesirable now. You know, when you talk with Taiwanese officials, there's this very sort of uncomfortable feeling when they're discussing Chiang Kai-shek, in a similar way that we saw in America when we were talking about the founding fathers during sort of the 2010s and early 2020s, where there was this sense of uncomfortableness about slavery or any other sort of historical ill that's associated with those historical figures. And it was just a very interesting and very direct parallel that I was witnessing.
They've become kind of problematic figures.
Yes, and I mean, there's even government bodies and government sort of committees in Taiwan that are dedicated to things like transitional justice, which is meant to sort of look back over the history of authoritarianism in Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT's rule in those early years after they fled the People's Republic, the Communist Party's sort of overtaking of the mainland.
So an interesting point I think you make in the piece is that Taiwan may be adopting some of these trends at the same point where the United States and maybe even the bulk of the West is starting to move away from them.
Yeah, so it seems like they're kind of behind the ball. And it honestly, as an American walking around Taiwan and observing these trends of transitional justice and sort of tearing down the legacy of these historical figures, I couldn't help but feel like we almost sort of scammed Taiwan into thinking this way, where just as they are now sort of leaning into this idea of retroactive justice, historical justice, we now are making a hard pivot away from it. Even, you know, obviously Donald Trump has made this a pretty cornerstone part of his sort of political agenda, is getting rid of this historical revisionism. But even Democrats now, you're not going to hear a lot of them talking about how bad Thomas Jefferson was or questioning George Washington. Those fringes still exist, but that's not mainstream discourse in America anymore. And it's been a very hard pivot, where it feels like Taiwan, unfortunately, started to adopt this rhetoric, probably sincerely trying to get on the same page as Western Europe and America and these different countries that were going through our own struggle sessions. It seems like just as they're now kind of catching up with us on that, we're now saying, oh, that was kind of a mistake. Maybe we shouldn't have torn down all those statues. Maybe we shouldn't have sort of undercut our founders like that.
So unlike the United States, which, you know, sort of by being the wealthiest country in the world and reserve currency of the world, at least for now, can sort of afford a certain amount of these sorts of trends, Taiwan is obviously a beleaguered country, not even really recognized as a country by much of the world, clearly threatened by the communists in mainland China. Sort of difficult to persevere in some of these sorts of conflicts if you don't have a certain amount of national self-confidence, no?
Well, yeah, one of the biggest conversations that you have with defense experts in Taiwan is about, one of the key factors for whether they can defend themselves at all is who is going to be willing to fight. How many young, able-bodied men are going to be willing to be brought in, conscripted, and fight for Taiwanese identity against a hypothetical encroaching of the People's Liberation Army from China. And if you're undercutting the sense of pride in Taiwan that, you know, should be there, you know, it's an amazing island, and its history is rich with this sort of rejection of an overwhelming wave of communism spreading across the mainland. If you undercut that legacy, much like in America, you'll see an undercut of civic pride, civic virtue, kind of a question of like, what are we even doing here? If we don't believe in our own country, if we don't even believe in our own history, like, why do we even care about our future?
Thank you, Tim. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can read Timothy's full story by clicking here on our digital magazine. The war in Iran is ongoing, but life in the Middle East goes on. Our Madeline Coyne explains how Israelis are persevering through this conflict.
The Israel Defense Forces, in partnership with the United States Air Force and Navy, set out to destroy the regime of Iran. On February 28th, Israeli fighter jets dropped thousands of pounds of explosives on a compound in Tehran, where Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was meeting with political and military officials.
Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Iranian terrorist regime, is dead.
This was soon accompanied by a bombing campaign joined by the USAF. Israelis call it Operation Roaring Lion, but here in the US, we know it as Operation Epic Fury. Since the October 7th attacks, assaults have been a near constant, with missiles from Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen. While Israelis did enjoy a brief period of relief late last year following the Gaza ceasefire, the air raid sirens have come roaring back. But life goes on as much as possible. It's just transformed into a missile-friendly life. Israelis have made bomb shelter lemonade out of lemons in other ways. Scenes of bomb shelter raves have dominated social media and even arrived in pages of Rolling Stone. One ever-hustling entrepreneur even developed an iPhone dating app that matches singles in public bomb shelters. Despite the ongoing war, Israelis can find normalcy, even if it is modified for war.
Thank you, Madeline. You can read that story and all the articles we've discussed today in Washington Examiner magazine. This has been your Inside Scoop. I'm Jim Antle, your host. We'll catch you next time.